Chapter Roman 36. Nothing left us but a grave, that small model of the barren earth, with dishonor for an epitaph. Judge Archibald proceeded to pass sentence. He began with the interesting and truthful remark, "I have anxiously considered whether anything less than the maximum penalty of the law will be adequate to meet the requirements of this case, and I think not." We had information that a few days previously a meeting of judges had been held, and that he had been advised to pass a life sentence. What he really meant to say was that he had anxiously considered whether anything less would be adequate to satisfy the Bank of England. He went on to say that we had not only inflicted great loss on the bank, but had also seriously discredited that great institution in the eyes of the public. He continued, "It is difficult to see the motives for this crime. It was not want, for you were in possession of a large sum of money. You are men of education, some of you speak the continental languages, and you have traveled considerably. I see no reason to make any distinction between you, and let it be understood from the sentence which I am about to pass upon you that men of education," and he may have added, what he undoubtedly thought, "Americans, who commit crimes which none but men of education can commit must expect a terrible retribution, and that sentence is penal servitude for life. And I further order that each one of you 388 pay 1/4 of the costs of prosecution, GBP 49.0 or $245.0 in all." And after all, what aroused so greatly his indignation? It was simply this: because we were youngsters and Americans, and had successfully assaulted the fondly imagined impregnable Bank of England, and, worse still, had held up to the laughter of the whole world its red tape idiotic management, for had the bank asked so common a thing as a reference, the fraud would have been made impossible. Let my reader contrast this modern Jeffreys, his savage tirade, and, for an offence against property, this most brutal sentence, with the treatment of the Warwickshire bank wreckers. Greenaway, the manager of this bank, and 3 of the directors, by false balance sheets and perjured reports for years had looted the bank, finally robbing the depositors of GBP 100, several of whom committed suicide and thousands more of whom were ruined. They were tried, convicted, and in being sentenced were told that, being men of high social position, the disgrace in itself was a severe punishment, therefore he should take that fact into consideration, and ended by sentencing 2 to 8 months, 1 to 12 and 1 to 14 months imprisonment. We were sentenced late at night, nearly 10 o'clock, a smoky, foggy London night. The court was packed, the corridors crowded, and when the jury came in with their verdict the suppressed excitement found vent. But when the vindictive and unheard-of sentence fell from the lips of this villain judge, an exclamation of horror fell from that crowded court. We turned from the judge, and went down the stairs to the entrance to the underground passage leading to Newgate. There we halted to say farewell. Before the governor, assistant warder reporting a prisoner for talking. Before the governor, assistant warder reporting a prisoner for talking. To say farewell. Yes, the Primrose Way had come to an end, but we were comrades and friends still, and in order 389 that in the gloom of the slow-moving days and the blackness and thick horror of the years to come we may have some thought in common, we then and there promised. What could we poor, broken bankrupts promise? Where or to what in the thick horror enshrouding us could we turn? We had nothing left us to call our own save death, and that small model of the barren earth, which serves as paste and cover to our bones, nothing but a grave, that small model of the barren earth, with dishonor and degradation for our epitaph. But there, in the very instant of our overwhelming defeat, standing in the dark mouth of the stone conduit leading from the Old Bailey to the dungeons of Newgate, by virtue of the high resolve we made, we conquered fate at her worst, and by our act in establishing the secret bond of sympathy in our separation dropped the bad, disastrous past, and starting on new things planted our feet on the bottom round of the ladder of success, feeling that, with plenty of faith and endurance, fortune, frown as she may now, must in some distant day turn her wheel and smile again. And what was this act? Why, it was a simple one, but bore in it the germ of great things. As we halted there in the gloom we swore never to give in, however they may starve us, evening grind us to powder, as we felt they would certainly try to do. We knew that in their anxiety about our souls they would be sure kindly to furnish each with a Bible, and we promised to read one chapter every day consecutively, and, while reading the same chapter at the same hour, think of the others. For 20 years we kept the promise. Then, making the resolve mentioned in the beginning of this book, I marched back to my cell. The door was opened and closed behind me, leaving me in pitch darkness, a convict in my dungeon. Dressed as I was, I lay down on the little bed there, and through all that long and terrible night, with a million dread images rushing through my brain, I lay passive, with wide open eyes, staring into the darkness, conscious that sanity and insanity were struggling for mastery in my brain, while I, like some interested spectator, watched the struggle, or, again, I was struggling in the air with some powerful but viewless monster form that clutched my throat with iron fingers, but whose body was impalpable to the grasp of my hands. A mighty space, an eternity of time and daylight came. Then, like one in a dream, I rose mechanically, and, finding the pin I had secreted, I stood on the little wooden bench, and, impelled by some spiritual but irresistible force, I scratched on the wall the message I had resolved to leave. In the reproof of chance lies the true proof of men. Then I thought of my friends and my promise, and, like one in a dream, I took the ill-smelling and dirty little Bible from the shelf, and, turning to the first chapter, read, "And the Spirit of God moved upon the waters. And God said, Let there be light, and there was light." Then the book fell from my hand, and I remembered no more. My mind had gone whirling into the abyss. I was sentenced on Wednesday. For 3 days, from Thursday to Sunday, my mind was a blank. I have no recollection of my removal under escort from Newgate to Pentonville. On Sunday, the 4th day of my sentence, like one rousing from a trance, I awoke to find myself shaven and shorn, dressed in a coarse convict uniform, in a rough cell of whitewashed brick. The small window had heavy double bars set with thick fluted glass, which, while admitting light, foiled any attempt of the eye to discern objects without. In the 391 corner there was a rusty iron shelf. A board let into the brickwork served for bed, bench, and table. A zinc jug and basin for water, with a wooden plate, spoon, and salt dish. No knife or fork for 20 years, completed the furnishings. As I was looking around in a helpless way, a key suddenly rattled in the lock, and, the door opening, a uniformed warder stepped in and, giving me a searching look, said in a rough voice, "Come on, you'll do for chapel. You have put on the balmy long enough." His kindly face belied his rough tones, and I followed him out of the door and soon found myself in the prison chapel. None was present, and I was ordered to sit on the front bench at the far end. The benches were simply common flat boards ranged in rows. Soon the prisoners came in singly, marching about 2 yards apart, and sat on the benches with that interval between them, that is, in the division of the chapel where I sat, it being separated from the rest by a high partition. Soon a white-robed, surpliced clergyman came in, and the service began. But I had no eye or ear, nor any comprehension save in a dim manner, as to what was going on. My brain was trying to connect the past and the present, feeling that something terrible had befallen me, but what it was I could not understand. When the services were over, I returned under the escort of the warder, who, when I arrived at my cell, ordered me to go in and close the door, which I did, banging it behind me. It had a spring lock, and when I heard the snap of the catch and looked at the narrow, barred window, with its thick, fluted glass admitting only a dim light, I remembered everything. Like a flash it all came to me, and I realized the full horror of my position. Sitting down on the little board fastened to the wall, serving as bed, seat, and table, I buried my face in my hands and began to ponder. Regrets came in floods, with remorse and despair hand in hand, when, realizing that it was madness to think, I sprang up, saying to myself the 392-hour and minute had come for me to decide, either for madness and a convict's dishonored grave, or to keep the promise I had made to my friends, never to give in, but to live and conquer fate. I determined then and there to live in the future and never to dwell on the horrible present or past. Then I remembered the last scene in Newgate and my promise to accompany my friends step by step, day by day, in our readings. Finding a Bible on the little rusty iron shelf in the corner, and this being the fourth day of our sentence, I turned to the fourth chapter. It gives the story of Cain's crime and punishment, and I read the graphic narrative with an intensity of interest difficult to describe. When I read, "And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me out this day from the face of the earth," I felt that the cry of Cain in all its intense naturalness, in its remorse and despair, was my own, and I was overcome. Laying the book down, I walked the floor for an hour in agony, until fantastic images came thronging thick and fast to my brain. I realized that my mind was going, and felt I must do something to make me forget my misery. I opened the Bible at random, and my eye caught the word misery. I looked closely at the verse and read, "You shall forget your misery and remember it as waters that pass away." I threw the book down, crying with vehemence, "That's a lie. God never gives something for nothing." Soon I opened the book again and looked at the context. Those of my readers who care to do so can do the same. The verse is Job Roman 11:16. The context begins at verse 13. "From that hour I never despaired again." The same day I began committing the book of Job to memory, and worked for dear life and reason. I became interested, and my interest in that wondrous poem deepened 393 until the study became a passion. Thus I turned the whole current of my thoughts into a new channel. Reason came back, and with it resolution and courage and strength. I was in Pentonville Prison, in the suburbs of London. All men convicted in England are sent to this prison to undergo 1 year's solitary confinement. At the completion of the year they are drafted away to the public works prisons, where, working in gangs, they complete their sentences. Of my experience in Pentonville during my year of solitude, it suffices to say that, passing through a great deal of mental conflict, I found I had grown stronger and was eager for transfer to the other prison, where I could for a few hours each day at least look on the sky and the faces of my fellow men. At last the day of transfer came, and, escorted by 2 uniformed and armed warders, I was taken to the famous Chatham prison, 27 miles from London on the River Medway. "You were sent here to work, and you will have to do it or I will make you suffer for it," was a friendly greeting that fell on my ears as I stood before a pompous little fellow, an ex-major from the army, at Chatham prison one lovely morning in 1874. I had arrived there under escort but an hour before, strong in the resolve to obey the regulations if I could, and never to give in if I had a fair chance, also with a desperate resolve never to submit to persecution, come what may, and these resolutions saved me, but only by a steady and dogged adherence to them on many occasions, through many years and amid surroundings that may well make me, as it did and does many good men, desperate and utterly reckless. After a few more remarks of a very personal and pungent nature, the little fellow marched off with a delicious swagger and an heroical air. I at once turned to the warder and asked, "Who is that little fellow?" "The governor." He 394 gasped out. "If he had only heard you," and then followed a pantomime that implied something very dreadful. Then I marched off to the doctor, and next to the chaplain, who, knowing who I was, asked me if I could read and write, to which I meekly replied, "Yes, sir," but apparently being doubtful upon the point he gave me a book. Opening it and pretending to read, I said in a solemn tone of voice, "When time and place adhere, write me down an ass." He took the book from me, looked at the open page, gazed solemnly in my face with a funny wagging of his head, as much as to say, "You will come to no good," and followed the little major. Then my cicerone took me into the main building, filled up to the brim with what seemed to be little brick and stone boxes, and, halting in front of one, said, "This is your cell." Looking around to see if it was safe to talk, he began to question me rapidly about my case, and getting no satisfaction he wound up the questioning with the remark, "Well, you tried to take all our money over to America." Then, becoming confidential, he told me what wicked fellows the other prisoners were, chiefly because they went to the governor and reported the officers, charging them with maltreatment and bullying particularly, and knocking them about generally. Of course, the warders never did such things, but were really of a very lamb-like and gentle nature. In order to back up their lies, the prisoners would knock their own heads against the walls, and then swear by everything good that someone of the warders had done it. I said, perhaps he had. Well, he said, perhaps an officer may give a man a little clip, but never so as to hurt him, and only in fun, you know. I felt at the time that I would never learn to appreciate Chatham fun, but on the very next day I was convinced of it when a man named Ferrier pulled out from his waistband a piece of rag, and, unrolling it, produced 2 of 397 his front tests with the information that a certain warder had struck him with his fist in the mouth and knocked them out. But to return to my narrative, after many wise saws and modern instances, he locked me up in the little brick and stone box and departed, having first informed me that I would go out to labor in the morning. I looked about my little box with a mixture of curiosity and consternation, for the thought smote me with blinding force that for long years that little box, 8 feet 6 inches in length, 7 feet in height, and 5 feet in width, with its floor and roof of stone, would be my only home, would be, must be, and no power could avert my fate. On the small iron shelf I found a tin dish used by some previous occupant and smeared inside and out with gruel. There being no water in my jug, when the men came in for dinner, I, in my innocence, asked one of the officers for some water to wash the dish. He looked at me with great contempt and said, "You are a precious flat. Lick it off, man. Before long you won't waste gruel by washing your tin dish. You won't be here many days and want to use water to clean your pint." After dinner I saw the men marched out to labor, and was amazed to see their famished, wolfish looks, thin, gaunt, and almost disguised out of all human resemblance by their ill-fitting, mud-covered garments and mud-splashed faces and hands. I myself was kept in, but the weary, almost ghastly spectre march I had witnessed constantly haunted me, and I said, will I ever resemble them? In youthful spirit and pride rushed to the front and cried, never. Night and supper 8 ounces of brown bread came at length, and I rose up from my meal cheerful and resolute to meet the worst, be it what it may short of deliberate persecution, with a stout heart and faith that at last all would be well. 398. In the morning I arose, had my breakfast 9 ounces of brown bread and 1 pint of gruel, and was eager to learn what this labor meant. I was prepared for much, but not for the grim reality. I had been ordered to join 82 party, a brick-making party, but working in the mud districts. So we, along with 200 others, marched out to our work, and as soon as we were outside of the prison grounds I saw a sight that, while it explained the mud-splashed appearance of my spectral array, was enough to daunt any man doomed to join in the game. Mud, mud everywhere, with groups of weary men with shovel and barrow working in it. A sort of road had been made over the mud with ashes and cinders, and our party of 22 men, with 5 other parties, moved steadily on for about a mile until we came to the clay banks or pits. Fortunately, we had a very good officer by the name of James. He wanted the work done, and used his tongue pretty freely. Still he was a man who would speak the truth, and treated his men as well as he dared to do under the brutal regime ruling in Chatham. He speedily told me off to a barrow and spade, and I was fully enlisted as barrow and spade man to Her Majesty. A steam mill, or pug, like a monster coffee mill, was used for mixing the clay and sand and delivering it in form of bricks below, where another party received them and laid them out to dry, preparatory to burning. Our duty was to keep the pug going, keep it full of clay to the top. The clay was in a high bank. We dug into it from the bottom with our spades and filled it as fast as possible into our barrows. In front of each man was a run, formed by a line of planks only 8 inches in width, and all converging toward and meeting near the pug. The distance we were wheeling was from 30 to 40 yards, and the incline was really very steep, but that in itself would not have been so bad. But the labor of digging out the clay was severe, and 399, that everlasting pug, was as hungry as if it were in the habit of taking plantation bitters to give it an appetite. One had no period of rest between the filling of one's barrow and the start up the run. In an hour's time my poor hands were covered with blood blisters, and my left knee was a lame duck truly, made so by the slight wrench given it each time I struck in my spade with my left foot. But I made no complaint. About 10 o'clock the man next to me with an oath threw down his spade and vowed he would do no more work. Putting on his vest and packet, he walked up to the warder, and quite as a matter of course turned his back to him and put both hands behind him. The warder produced a pair of handcuffs, and without any comment handcuffed his hands in that position, and then told him to stand with his back to the work. No one took the slightest notice, and the toil did not slacken for an instant, but one man was out of the game, and we had to make his side good. Noon came at last. We dropped our spades, hastily slipped on our jackets, and at once set off at a quick march for the prison. I naturally looked at the various gangs piloting their way through the mud and all steering in a straight line for the Appian way whereon we were, for, as all roads lead to Rome, so all the sticky ways on the works led to the prison. Our laconic friend was trudging on behind the party, and to my surprise I noticed that several of the other parties had un enfant perdu, hands behind his back, marching in the rear, and as soon as we reached the prison each poor sheep in the rear fell out quite as a matter of course. When all the men were in, a warder came up and gave the order, right turn, forward, and off the poor fellows marched to the punishment cells for 3 days' bread and water each, and no bed unless one designates an oak plank as such. It was all very sad. It was pitiful to see the matter-of-fact way in which every one concerned took it all. So my first day in the mud and clay came to an end, and I found myself once more in my little box with a night before me for rest, and thought, although I had suffered, yet there were grounds for gratitude and hope, and I felt that I may regard the future steadily and without despair. Visitor trying on the Haymans or on pinioning belt at Newgate. Chapter Roman 37. Henceforth the light was to stream through the fluted glass of my window. The first day was over, but it seemed to me that something more must come, that what I had gone through could mean the life of a day must surely be impossible. Was there nothing before me but isolation so complete that no whisper from the outside world could reach me? That world which, compared with the death into which I was being absorbed, seemed the only world of the living. Had I actually nothing to look for but the most repulsive work under the most repulsive conditions? I said there must be surely some change. That wheeling mud forever was not the doom of any man and could certainly not be mine. I looked about my little cell, the stillness of the grave without, the utter solitude within. The ration which formed my supper was on the table, 8 ounces of black bread. Try as I may to cheat myself with hope, I knew that hope for many a long year there was none, that so far as the most vindictive sentence could compass it, for many a long year the earth with her bars was about me. No de profundis cry could ever ascend from the abyss to the bottom of which I had fallen. What was outside of me had nothing but the hideous. But although the visible seemed corruption, and the things which my soul, and body too, had refused to touch were become my sorrowful meat, yet I could not but feel 402 that the invisible, that part of me which no bars could hold and no man deprive me of, was still my own, and that in it I may and would find sufficient to support what I began to feel was, after all, the only man. To face the actualities of the position was the first thing, not to cheat myself. The second, I had seen the sort of men I was to be with. I set to work to study, and to understand the kind of life we were to live together. At early dawn we rose, receiving immediately after the 9 ounces of bread and pint of oatmeal gruel, which composed breakfast. At 6:30, to chapel to hear one of the schoolmasters drone through the morning prayers of the English church service, and listen to some hymn shouted out from throats never accustomed to such accents. Then the morning hours would drag slowly on in the summer's sun and winter's blast until the noon hour. Then there was the long march back from the scene of my toil to the prison for dinner. Arriving there, each man went to his cell, closing his door, which snapped to having a spring lock. Soon after, a dinner is given consisting of 16 ounces of boiled potatoes and 5 ounces of bread, varied on 3 days of the week with 5 ounces of meat additional. At 1 o'clock the doors were unlocked, and we marched out to our work again. At night, returning to the prison, 8 ounces of black bread would be doled out for supper. Then came the hours between supper and bedtime. When shut in between those narrow walls, one realized what it was to be a prisoner. In the corner of the cell there was a board let into the stonework. There was a thin pallet and 2 blankets rolled up together during the day in a corner of the cell that served for bedding. But so thin and hard was the pallet that one may almost as well have slept on the board. For the first few weeks this bed made my bones ache. Most men have little patience and small fortitude, and this bed kills many 403 of the prisoners. I mean breaks their hearts, simply because they have not the wit to accept the matter philosophically and realize that they can soon become used to any hardship. It took 6 months for my bones to become used to the hard bed, but for the next 19 years I used to sleep as sweetly on that oak board as I ever did or now do in a bed of down, only, like Jean Valjean, in Les Miserables, I had become so used to it that upon my liberation I found it impossible for a time to sleep in a bed. On a little rusty iron shelf, fixed in the corner, was our tinware. Although called tinware, it really was zinc, and was susceptible, through much hard work, of a high polish. But this polishing tinware was a fearful curse to the poor prisoner. It consisted of a jug for water, and a bowl for washing in, and a pint dish for gruel. There were strict and imperative orders, rigidly enforced, that this tinware should be kept polished, the result being that the men never washed themselves, and never took water in their jugs, for if they did their tinware would take a stain, go off, as it was termed, the result being that if the poor devil washed and kept himself clean he would be reported and severely punished for having dirty tinware. A prisoner is not permitted to receive anything from his friends or communicate with them in any way, save only once in 3 months he is permitted to write and receive a letter, provided he is a good character and has not been reported for any infraction of the rules for 3 months, for if reported for any cause, however trifling, the privilege of writing is postponed for 3 months. And, as a matter of fact, more than half of the men never get a chance to write during their imprisonment. Chapter Roman 38. What, these tedious details again? It will be well to present here some account of those who were to rule my life for so many years. The Board of Prison Commissioners have their headquarters at the Home Office in Parliament Street, London, and are under the control of the Home Secretary of State. One of these visits each of Her Majesty's convict establishments once a month, in order to try any cases of insubordination which are of too serious a nature for the governor of the prison to adjudicate upon, he not being permitted to order any penalty beyond a few days of bread and water and loss of a limited number of remission marks. The head authority at each prison is the governor, of whom the largest establishments, like Chatham, have 2. Next comes the deputy governors, the medical officer, and an assistant doctor, the chaplains and schoolmasters, Protestant and Catholic. There are 4 grades of prison warders, viz. The chief warder, principal warders, warders, and assistant warders. The chief warder, of course, stands first in the list, and his duties, if honestly executed, render him the most important, as he is the most responsible of the prison officials, save, perhaps, the medical officer, who is the autocrat of the place. But, in case anything goes wrong, he is the man who gets all the blame, and when matters run smoothly and well, the governor gets all the thanks. During the absence of the governor, the deputy takes his 405 place, and in turn the chief warder performs the duties of the deputy governor's office. As all business passes through the chief's hands, he must be a fair scholar, though sometimes a principal warder who understands bookkeeping is detailed to assist him. He must be of strict integrity, a thorough disciplinarian, and of a character to make him respected both by his superiors and inferiors in position. The warders of all grades are under his command, and must fear him for his inflexibility in punishing any breach of regulations, and have confidence in his disposition to act justly toward them, he being the one on whom the governor relies for all information regarding their conduct. It is on the reports of the chief warder that the governor acts in all cases involving their promotion, reprimands, or fines, and their application for leave of absence must be approved of and signed by him. It is clear that unless he is very straight in the performance of his duties, he would soon place himself in the power of some of the warders, who would not fail to take advantage of any knowledge of his derelictions to benefit themselves, and to the detriment of discipline and good order. Under the English government, the salary of a man possessing these superior qualifications is between $500 and $600 a year, and his uniform. This is of blue cloth, the sleeves and collar of his coat and his cap embroidered with gold lace. On alternate days, at the prison where I was confined, he came on duty at 5 a.m. in summer and 5:30 in winter, and left the prison at 4 p.m., leaving in charge a principal warder, coming on duty the following morning at 7 a.m. At 6 p.m., after receiving the reports from the ward officers, stating the number of prisoners each has just locked up, and thus seeing that all are safe, he locks with his master key the gates and outer doors of the main buildings, and before finally retiring for the night he must lock the outer gate, so that no one but the governor can get in or out, each watchman being locked 406 into the ward which he is set to guard. There are bells in his room connecting with the various wards, and in case of sickness or any other emergency, he is the man who is aroused. It is the chief warder who keeps everything connected with the prison in running order, and whatever goes wrong, the cry is for the chief, and he is sent for, be it day or night. In a large establishment there are a dozen or more principal warders. These are the lieutenants of the chief, and have general supervision of the working parties. Their pay is about $400 a year, and uniforms. There are of the other two grades, warders and assistant warders, from 2,000 to 3,000 employed in all Her Majesty's prisons in Great Britain and Ireland. Warders and assistant warders are provided with a short, heavy truncheon, which each carries in his hand or in a leather sheath which hangs from his belt, to which is also attached a sort of cartouch box in which he keeps the keys, which are fastened to a chain, the other end to his belt. When about to leave the prison, on going off duty, he must hang up the belt and attachments in the chief warder's office. Their pay, besides uniforms, which are of blue cloth, is $350 a year for warders and $300 for assistant warders. All promotions are by seniority. In case of transfer by authorities to any other prison, they retain their position in the line of promotion, but if they volunteer or make application to be transferred, they have to begin at the bottom in reckoning the length of service for promotion. When the authorities wish to transfer warders, it is usual for them to call for volunteers, of whom they find a sufficient number anxious for a change, unless the transfer is to an unpopular station, such as Dartmoor, which is among the bogs, and a lonely, bleak place. They do it differently in China. They don't use straight jackets in Persia. Warders are exempted from doing night duty, which is all done by the assistant warders, who are on that service 1 week out of 3, although when on night duty they 407 had the day for sleep and recreation. I never saw one who did not detest it, because they must remain on duty continuously for 12 hours, and must not read, sit down, nor lean against anything, nor have their hands behind them. These military regulations apply as well to the whole time they are on duty in the prison, day or night. A few years ago the time of daily duty was reduced to 12 hours, with 1 hour at noon for dinner. Besides this, at times they must do a good deal of extra duty. Each is allowed 10 days annual holiday, but is frequently obliged to take it piecemeal, a day or 2 at a time, so that he cannot go far away from the scene of his servitude. Their duties require unflagging attention and never-ceasing vigilance, which must be a heavy tax on the brain, and the 12 hours must be passed in standing or walking about. In fact, they are subjected to military discipline, or rather despotism, and any known infraction of the rules subjects them to penalties according to the nature of the offense. leaning against a wall, sitting down, etc. For a first offense, they are mulcted in a small sum, 12 to 60 cents, usually, and are put back in the line of promotion. The fines go to the officer's library fund. I knew one officer, Joseph Matthews, who had been assistant warder 20 years, and, being frequently set back for doing some small favor to prisoners, was discharged from the service in 1886 without a pension for some slight breach of regulations. He had a wife and 6 children and had worked 20 years for less than $7 per week. For giving a convict a small bit of tobacco, a heavy fine, suspension, and in case it was not the first offense, expulsion from the service without a pension. For acting the go-between and facilitating correspondence with the friends of convicts, expulsion, possibly imprisonment. One of the assistant warders, who was convicted of having received a bribe of GBP 100 from one of us at Newgate, was expelled from the service and imprisoned 18 months. Another at 408 Portsmouth Prison underwent the same fate, save that his term was but 6 months, for sending and receiving letters for a prisoner, and similar cases are of frequent occurrence. The warders and assistant warders are the ones who come in direct and constant contact with prisoners, and when the eye of no superior authority is on them, or nothing else to deter, they are hail fellow well met with such of the convicts as are unprincipled enough to curry favor with and assist them in covering up their peccadilloes from their superiors. They naturally recoil at the hardness and parsimony of the government toward them, evading the performance of duties when they can, and I have heard more than one say, "Why should we care what prisoners do, so long as we don't get into trouble?" The government grinds us down to 12 hours daily duty on just pay enough to keep body and soul together. Then, if we complain, tells us that we can leave if we like, as there are others ready to step into our places. Bah! What do we care for the government? It is of no benefit to us. The big guns get big pay, and the higher up the office the more the pay and the less the work. To be sure, we can go out of the prison to sleep, but otherwise we are bound as closely as you are. Yet these very warders, the moment any superior authority appears on the scene, are as obsequious and fawning as whipped dogs, and recoup themselves for this forced humiliation by taking it out of such of the convicts as fail to curry their favor, or offend, or make them trouble. Surely their office is a very responsible one, and it is blind, false economy to retain low-priced men in such a position. The present English system of penal servitude is perfect on paper, but the moral qualities of most of the warders and assistant warders preclude all possibility of the reformation of those in their charge. Notwithstanding the expositions of the English delegates at the international meetings, prison reform has never yet been tried in Great Britain and Ireland. In other words, all 409 efforts in that direction have been defeated by placing convicts in the immediate charge of a class of men who, by education and training, possess none of the qualifications requisite for such a responsible position. In so far as forms are concerned, the business of the prison is carried on most systematically. There are blank forms which cover everything, from provisioning the prison to bathing the men, and these must be filled in and signed by the warder in charge of the particular work being done. For example, every week he must fill in the proper form and certify that every man in his ward has had a bath. I have known men to go unbathed for many months, simply because they did not wish to bathe, and it saved the warder trouble. Nearly all others in the ward only bathed about once a month, and yet at the stated times the officer filled up and signed the form, certifying to the superior authorities that those in his ward had been bathed at the regulation times. A great majority of the officers are soldiers who have been invalided or pensioned off after doing the full term for which they enlisted, 12 years, and of sailors in the same condition. In order to encourage enlistment into the Army and Navy, the government gives discharged soldiers and sailors the preference in the civil service, apparently heedless as to their moral qualifications. Truly, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain about these, for the very nature and present requirements of these services tend to harden and make men conscienceless, subservient and fawning toward their superiors, and tyrannical to those in their power. As to those in the prison service, There are many who would be good men in a situation suited to their requirements, and there are but a few of those who are brought into immediate contact with the men who, in fact, virtually hold the power of life and death over them, whose influence is of an elevating or reforming kind. Truly, I have heard 410 many of them telling or exchanging obscene stories with prisoners, and using the vilest language and bandying thieves' slang, in which they become proficient. I am bold to say that at least one half of all I have known are in morals on a level with the average prisoner, or, as I have heard more than one assistant warder say, too much of a coward to steal, shamed to beg, and too lazy to work, therefore became a soldier, then a warder. This may, at the moment, have been spoken in a jesting way, but it is none the less true. What can be expected in the way of refinement and good morals from a class of men who entered the army or navy, coming, as they did in most cases, from the untaught and mind-debased multitude with which that land of drink and debauchery swarms? It will be seen from the foregoing that very much is expected from them, and in order to fulfill the very hard terms of their contract with the government and keep their places, they are forced to resort to trickery, deception, and perjury, until these, in their attitude toward their employer, the government, become second nature, readily resorting to lies to clear themselves from blame, evening in trivial matters, to save themselves from a sixpence fine. There are jealousies among themselves, but, when it is a question of deceiving or keeping any neglect of duties or violences against prisoners from the superior authorities, they all unite as one man and affirm or swear to anything they think the position requires. A real pleasure was derived from those prisoners' friends, the rats and mice, which I easily tamed and taught to be my companions. Come on, you are free, page 480. Come on, you are free, page 480. Not long after my arrival, a prisoner gave me a young rat, which became the solace of an otherwise miserable existence. Nothing could he cleaner in its habits or more affectionate in disposition than this pet member of a despised race of rodents. It passed all its leisure time in preening its fur, and after eating always most scrupulously cleaned 411 its hands and face. It was easily taught, and in course of time it could perform many surprising feats. I made a small trapeze, the bar being a slate pencil about 4 inches long, which was wound with yarn and hung from strings of the same, and on this the rat would perform like an acrobat, appearing to enjoy the exercise as much as the performance always delighted me. I made a long cord out of yarn, on which it would climb exactly in the manner in which a sailor shins up a rope, and when the cord was stretched horizontally it would let its body sway under and travel along the cord, clinging by its hands and feet like a human performer. A rat's natural position when eating a piece of bread is to sit on its haunches, but I had trained this rat to stand upright on its feet, with its head up like a soldier. Placing it in front of me on the bed, I would hand it a piece of bread, which it would hold up to its mouth with its hands while standing erect, keeping one sharp eye on me and the other on its food. The moment it noticed that I was not looking, it would gradually settle down upon its haunches. When my eyes turned on it, it would instantly straighten itself up like a schoolboy caught in some mischief. It always showed great jealousy of my tame mice, and I had to be very careful not to let it get a chance to get at one. On one occasion I was training one of the mice, and did not notice that the rat was near. Suddenly, like a flash, it leaped nearly 2 feet, seizing the mouse by the neck precisely as a tiger seizes its prey. Although I instantly snatched it away, it was too late, the one fierce bite having severed the jugular. I have mentioned mice, and truly they were most interesting pets, easily trained and as scrupulously clean and neat as any creature of a higher race could be. I at times had a half-dozen of them, which I had caught in the following simple way. I first stuck a small bit of bread on the inside 412 of my pint tin cup, about halfway down, then turning it bottom up on the floor, I raised one edge just high enough so that a mouse could enter, and let the edge of the cup rest on a splinter. It would not be long before one would enter, and as it could not reach the bread otherwise, it stood up, putting its hands against the sides of the cup, thus overbalancing it, causing the cup to drop, and simple Mousie would find itself also a prisoner. Although there was an order that no prisoner should be permitted to have any kind of pets, especially rats and mice, and as the prison swarmed with these, the warders had become tired of being obliged to turn over the cells and prisoners daily in search of these contraband favorites, the loss of which generally provoked the owners to insubordination, in consequence of which there was a tacit understanding that they were not to be interfered with, provided they were kept out of sight when the governor made his rounds. Nothing could overcome the jealousy of my otherwise gentle rat when it saw me petting a mouse, and it would watch for an opportunity to spring upon its diminutive rival and put a speedy end to its career. I had one mouse which to its other accomplishments added the following. It would lie in the palm of my open hand, with its 4 legs up in the air, pretending to be dead, only the little creature kept its bright eyes wide open, fixed on my face. As soon as I said, "Come to life," it would spring up, rush along my arm, and disappear into my bosom like a flash. 413. 1 Austin, 2 Givo, McDonald 3 Officer 4 Geo, Bidwell 5 Officer 6 Noise 7 Mr. Straight, QC, McDonald speaking to Mr. Straight, QC. During the trial 1 Austin, 2 Givo, McDonald 3 Officer 4 Geo, Bidwell 5 Officer 6 Noise 7 Mr. Straight, QC, McDonald speaking to Mr. Straight, QC. During the trial, I had a mouse trained the same as the one above described, and was in dread lest a warder should see and destroy it. Therefore, in the hope of getting a guarantee for its safety, one day when the medical officer on his round came to my cell with his retinue, I put my mouse through the dead dog performance. The little fellow lay exposed 414 in my hand with one of its twinkling eyes fixed on me, and the other on these strangers. Such was its confidence in me, that it went through the performance perfectly, and when I gave the signal in an instant it was in my, as the poor thing believed, protecting bosom. The doctors laughed, and the retinue of course followed suit. If they had frowned, the latter would have done likewise. The doctors appeared so pleased that I felt certain they would order the warder, as was in their power, to let me keep my harmless pet, the sole companion of my solitude and misery, unmolested. They went outside the cell and lingered. In a moment then the warder came in, and after a struggle got the mouse out of my bosom and put his heel upon it. I am not ashamed to confess that I cried over the loss of this poor little victim of overconfidence in human beings. I once procured a beetle with red stripes across its wing sheaths, and trained it to show some degree of intelligence. This was for months the sole companion of my solitude, but it was at last discovered in my possession and taken away. I made friends with the flies and found that they displayed no small degree of intelligence. I soon had a dozen tamed, and in the course of my long observations I discovered, among other things, that the males were very tyrannical over the fair sex and tried to prevent them from getting any of the food. In the summer mornings at daylight they would gather on the wall next my bed and wait patiently until I placed a little chewed bread on the back of my hand, when instantly there was a rush, and the first one who got possession, if a male, tried to prevent the rest from alighting, and would dart at the nearest, chasing it in zigzags far away. In the meantime another would have attained possession, and it went for the next corner, and for a long time there would be a succession of fierce encounters, until at last all had made good their footing and feasted harmoniously, for as fast as one succeeded in alighting it 416 was let alone. Sometimes a male would take possession of my forehead, and, in case I left him unmolested, he would keep off intruders on what he evidently considered his domain by darting at them in a ferocious manner. On one occasion I noticed a fly that had one of its hind legs turned up, apparently out of joint. As it was feeding on my hand I tried to put my finger on the leg to press it down. During 3 or 4 such attempts it moved away, after which it appeared to recognize my kind intention, and stood perfectly still while I pressed on the leg. It may be unnecessary to add that I failed in performing a successful surgical operation. As the winter approached the flies began to lose their legs and wings. Those that lost their wings would walk along the wall until they came to the usual waiting spot, and as soon as I put a finger against the wall the maimed creature would crawl to the usual place on my hand for breakfast. Chapter Roman 39. The days, O summer, merrily spent in the land of the heather. In the cell next to mine was a prison genius named Heap, who was one of the most singular characters I ever met. As I shall have occasion to speak of him frequently, I may as well give here a sketch of his life as related to me by himself. He was born in the town of Macclesfield, near Manchester, in 1852, of respectable mechanics, or tradespeople as they are called in England. His father died when Heap was about 5 years of age, and after a time his mother married a carpenter and joiner of the place. Young Heap was a lively child, up to all sorts of tricks, and does not remember the time since he could walk that he was not in some mischief, and, as he remarked, took to all sorts of deviltry as naturally as a duck to water. As long as his father lived there was not much check on his mischievous propensities, but his stepfather proved to be a severe and stern judge, and brought him to book for every irregularity, thrashing him most unmercifully for each offense. His mother could not have filled her maternal duty very judiciously, judging from the fact that before he was 12 years old she set him to follow and watch his stepfather to the house of a woman of whom she was jealous. The boy possessed great natural abilities and in good hands would have turned out something different than a lifelong prison drudge. He was handsome, genteel in 418 appearance, an apt scholar, though very self-willed and headstrong, and as he grew up his naturally hot temper became uncontrollable. At an early age he had discovered that by threats of self-injury he could bend his parents to his wishes, but found in his stepfather one who would put up with no nonsense. Evening when he cut himself so as to bleed freely, instead of the coveted indulgence it only procured him an additional thrashing. At 15 he had become ungovernable at home, and his father had him put in the county insane asylum, where he remained a year and a half. While there he caused so much trouble that the attendants were only too glad when he escaped and went to Liverpool. Here he succeeded in getting a situation with a dealer in bric-a-brac, rare books, and antiquities. In a short time the proprietor placed so much confidence in his integrity that he gave him the charge of his place during his own absences, and young Heap was not long in taking advantage of his position to rob his employer by taking a book or other article which he sold to someone of his master's customers. This went on for some time until on one occasion he took the book to a shop kept by a woman to whom he had previously sold several articles, and offered it for a sovereign. She examined it and found that it was an ancient, illuminated Greek manuscript, worth 50 times more than the price young Heap asked for it, and, suspecting something wrong, she told him to come again for the money the next evening. At the appointed time he entered the place, and was confronted by his master, who contented himself with upbraiding him for his perfidy and discharging him from his service. At this period of his career he had contracted vicious habits, the most pernicious for him being that of drink, for when sober he was in his right mind, but the moment the drink was in his common sense departed, and he became 419 a raving maniac, ready to fight or perpetrate any other act of folly. Up to this time he had never been tempted to steal only in order to supply means for improper indulgences. Not long after being discharged from his situation he was found by the police acting in so insane a manner under the influence of drink that the magistrate before whom he was taken had him sent to the Raynell lunatic asylum. Here, being perfectly reckless, he carried on all sorts of games which made him obnoxious, although making himself very useful in work which he liked, such as gardening, etc. He also took up fancy painting and soon became a skillful copyist of prints of any description, enlarging or reducing, and painting them in oil or water colors. He also became a good decorator and scene painter, besides devoting time to various studies, including music. At last he found means to effect his escape and lay in hiding until night. Then, as he had on the asylum clothes, which would betray him, he went back and got in through the window of the tailor's shop, which was in an isolated building, and exchanged the clothes he had on for a suit belonging to one of the attendants. Thinking himself now safe from recognition, he started off across the country, but had not gone more than 20 miles when, in passing through a small town, a policeman who had just heard of the escape from Raynell arrested him on suspicion. The Raynell authorities sent someone to identify him. He was taken back, tried on the charge of stealing the attendant's suit of clothes, which he still had on, was convicted by the usual intelligent jury and sentenced to 5 years penal servitude. He finished his term of imprisonment at Chatham, and instead of being set at liberty was sent under guard back to the asylum. According to English law, if a person confined in a lunatic asylum escapes and keeps away 14 days, he 420 cannot after that be arrested, unless he commits fresh acts of insanity. After several futile attempts, he at last made good his escape and obtained work with a farmer, where he remained safe for 13 days, and was congratulating himself that in less than another day he would be free, when his thoughts were broken off by the appearance of 2 attendants who seized and carried him back to the asylum. The events above narrated had driven him into a state of desperation at what he felt to be gross injustice, and he carried on in such a way that the doctor ordered his head to be shaved and blistered as a punishment, the straitjacket and all other coercive measures having been of no avail. The night watchman had orders to watch him closely, but he kept so sharp an eye on the watchman that he caught him asleep, and, creeping to the closet window, which he had previously tampered with, crept out, and after climbing the low wall found himself on a raw November night, with the rain falling in torrents, stark naked, had shaved and blistered, but once more a free man. In this condition he wandered on throughout the night, and just before daylight he entered a cemetery to find that refuge among the dead of which he thought himself so cruelly deprived by the living. Beneath the entrance to the church there was a passage which led to some family vaults in the basement, and he crept down the passage to seek some shelter for his nude body from the driving rain, which had chilled him through. While groping about in the dark, his hand rested on something soft, which, to his unbounded delight, proved to be an old coat which had probably been left there by the sexton and forgotten. He remained hidden all day and traveled through the fields all night, during which he found a scarecrow, from which he transferred to his own person its old hat and trousers. He said that although so hungry, he never had felt so happy as he did at finding himself once more dressed up. After proceeding a few miles farther, he ventured into a laborer's cottage in quest of food, which was given him, and with it a pair of old boots. As dilapidated, ragged, vagabond-looking, honest people are common in England, no questions were asked, and he proceeded on his way rejoicing in that freedom of which he had been deprived for 10 years or more. Amid all his pranks he had never been charged with idleness, and now worked at odd jobs about the farms until he had procured a decent suit of clothes, when he applied to a master house painter for work as a journeyman, though he had never done anything of that kind. The master, pleased with his appearance, gave him a trial, but the first job showed such ignorance of the art of house painting that he was immediately discharged with half a day's wages. However, he had picked up some valuable hints, and being very apt by the time he had been more or less summarily discharged from half a dozen places, he had become a good workman, and henceforth had no trouble about retaining any situation as long as he refrained from beer and restrained his temper. But at the slightest fault-finding on the part of the master he would fly into a passion and throw up the situation, and this, especially, if he suspected that anything had leaked out about his imprisonment. While at work with a companion at painting the interior of a gentleman's residence near Bradford, a word or two was dropped, which made him believe his fellow workmen had become aware of his being an ex-convict. Quitting work, he went to a public house, passing the rest of the day in carousing. About midnight, while on his way to his boarding house, it occurred to him that he had noticed a good many valuable things about the gentleman's house 422 which he could obtain. No sooner thought than done. The entrance was in a moment gained. He had just consciousness enough left to gather a few things, then lie down by the side of them and fell into a drunkard's sleep, in which the servants found him when they came down in the morning. A constable was sent for, he was given in charge, tried, convicted of the crime of burglary, and sentenced to 7 years penal servitude. His former term of 5 years had made him proficient in all the dodges of prison life, and he felt justified in his own mind in using all his craft in order to put in his 7 years as easily as possible. As he had been in Raynell Asylum, he knew that by putting on the balmy, so as to be sent to the lunatic department he would not be subjected to the prison rules and be as well off as he had been in the free asylum. Persistent attempts at suicide by cutting himself in the arms and legs with a piece of glass so as to bleed freely accomplished his purpose. Being placed with the other convict lunatics, he made himself useful, but on account of his bad temper and overbearing, quarrelsome disposition, obnoxious to his fellow prisoners. Eventually he was discharged with an 18 months ticket of leave and $2.50 as capital for a new departure. He went to Liverpool, procured a passage on board a freight steamer to America, which he paid for by working at painting. Landing at New York, he made his way to Norfolk, where he procured work as a painter. Owing to his infirmity of temper he did not keep his place long, and after knocking about for a few months he took a freak to return to England, the last place of all for any man who has once been a prisoner. After imprisonment, from photo by Stewart, Hartford. After imprisonment, from photo by Stewart, Hartford. Once more in his native land, he procured work without difficulty at house painting, but, as usual, remained in one place but a very short time. His earnings, like those of a 423 great majority of the working class in England, were squandered in the public house. Soon after the events just recorded, Heap concluded to visit his old home in Macclesfield. He accordingly threw up his situation and arrived at the railway station an hour before the train was due. In order to while away the time he entered a public house and drank several glasses of ale. The compartment which he entered happened to be empty, and as usual whenever he indulged his appetite for anything containing alcohol, he was soon quite out of his mind and fancied that someone on the train was coming to murder him, and leaped headlong from the train, which was going at the rate of 40 miles an hour. This came to a standstill. He was taken on board again, not seriously injured, and left at Wrexham in Denbighshire, from which he was sent to the Denbigh Insane Asylum. This, being a Welsh institution, did not, according to Heap, possess those facilities for enjoying life which were so liberally supplied to the inmates of the Raynell Asylum near Liverpool. Accordingly he behaved himself with so much propriety that the doctor discharged him as cured. Not long after his return he got work near Manchester at painting in a block of new houses, where the plumbers were at work putting in the gas and water pipes. On a Saturday, when he left work at noon, he met a young plumber who was out of a job. This man said he knew where he could earn a sovereign if he had tools to do a job in a butcher's shop, and told Heap that if he would go to the houses where he had been painting, and borrow a few plumber's tools and assist him, he would divide the amount. Heap went back, but finding that the master plumber and all his men had gone Saturday afternoon in England, being a half-holiday for laborers, he took the few tools required, went and finished the job by 7 p.m. Then, instead of taking the tools back, they went into a 424 public house where they caroused till midnight, when they separated, Heap taking the tools to his boarding house. On Monday he started early, so as to get the tools back before the other workmen arrived. On nearing the houses he passed a policeman who walked a little lame. He turned his head to look back, and the policeman happened to do the same thing, and seeing Heap looking at him his suspicions were aroused. Turning back, he came up and asked him what he had in the two bosses' tool baskets. Heap informed him, and on further questioning showed him the key to the house from which he had taken the tools, and asked him to accompany him there, which he did. They entered, Heap putting back the tools, and showed the policeman where he had been painting and wished him to stay until the master came in half an hour. This the policeman declined to do, and took the tools and told Heap to come to the police station. Heap lost his temper and began cursing him. The policeman went to the door, and seeing another just passing beckoned him in, and the two marched him to the station. The plumber was sent for, and was induced to make a charge against Heap, and value the stolen goods at 10 shillings. Seeing that the police were bound to make a case against him, he seized the plumber's knife and cut his throat, severing the windpipe. The doctor was sent for, he was transferred to the jail hospital, and in the course of 2 or 3 weeks was well enough to appear before the magistrate, though he could not speak, and was bound over for trial. In the meantime, the police had discovered that he had served 2 penal terms, on the strength of which, when convicted, the magistrate sentenced him to 10 years penal servitude. At the trial, he had not yet recovered the use of his voice, nor did he have anyone to defend him, for at that 425 time, unlike the present, the Crown did not furnish a lawyer for the defense of those who were unable to employ one at their own expense. When the magistrate was about to pronounce the sentence, he said that as the prisoner had escaped from ordinary asylums, he should send him to a place from which he could not escape, meaning a prison. Bank of England scene. Visitor holding GBP 100,500 Bank of England notes. Chapter 40. We will ferry you over Jordan that rolls between. Once convicted of a crime in England, it is impossible, unless a man has money or friends, for him to obtain an honest livelihood unless he is the happy possessor of a trade. All the great corporations demand references that will cover a series of years of the applicant's life, and, above all, strict inquiry is made as to his last employer. This cuts the ground out from under the feet of the unfortunate, and feeling that England can no longer be a home to him, he turns his eyes as a matter of course to America. A fair percentage of the prisoners are men who, perhaps under great temptation, or while under the influence of drink, have broken the laws, but yet are honorably minded and resolved in future to lead an honest life. Such are not undesirable citizens, but there is another class, that of the professional criminal. With these the prisons swarm, and worse yet, the slums and saloons of the great cities are breeding thousands more that will take the places of those now on the stage. The conditions of society in England are such that the procession of criminals is an unending one. The society that creates the criminal also has established a system of police repression that makes the life history of society's victim one of misery, until such time when the criminal, growing wise by experience, shakes the dust of English 427 soil off from his feet and transfers himself, a moral ruin, to our country, here to become a curse and a burden. This flow of moral sewage to our shores is constant and unceasing. Our government has frequently protested against it, but with no success, for the officials in England indignantly deny that the state either encourages or assists the exodus of her criminal classes. But from my personal knowledge I know this to be false. The officials over there have found out an effectual way to rid themselves of their discharged prisoners as fast as their sentences expire, and cast them on our shores, and this is so ingenious a way that the wrong can never be brought home to them. During my 20 years' residence in Chatham, I suppose nearly half as many thousands asked me for information about America, and at least 95% assured me that when released they would join the society and depart at once for that happy hunting ground, that promised land which charms the imagination no less of the criminal than of the honest poor of the old world. In every English prison the walls are decorated with placards, gorgeous in hue, of rival firms appealing to the readers for patronage. Join us, they all say, and every prisoner knows the appeal. Join us means, if you do, we will ferry you over the Jordan that rolls between this desert land and the plains flowing with milk and honey on the other side. The firms I mention are those arch humbugs, the Prisoners' Aid Societies of England. Elizabeth Fry, who made aid to prisoners fashionable and a society fad in England, has much to answer for. Prisoners' aid societies have sprung up in every quarter of England, and having a rich soil, and under the fostering care of the government, have flourished with a rank and luxuriant growth. These societies draw their nourishment from English soil, but, unhappily for us, their tall branches 428 hang over our wall, and their ripened fruit falls on our ground. From the time a prisoner becomes accustomed to his surroundings until the hour of his release, the one thing ever uppermost in his thoughts, the one distracting subject and cause of anxious solicitude, is the question, which society shall I join? It is a tolerably safe venture to predict that he will join the Royal Prisoners' Aid Society of London, which society is happy in having Her Gracious Majesty and a long list of illustrious lords and ladies for governors. What that may mean no one knows. Certainly no benefit from these people ever accrues to the discharged prisoners, but who can describe the glory that falls on the 4 or 5 reverend gentlemen, sons, nephews or brothers of deans or bishops, high-salaried secretaries of this particular society, who pose at the annual meeting in Exeter Hall before a brilliant audience, and after have the felicity of seeing their report in the church and society journals and their names connected with such exalted people? The way the government over there accomplishes its purpose of getting rid of its criminal population at our expense and at the same time is able to answer the charges of our government with disavowal is this. The Home Secretary alone possesses the pardoning power for the United Kingdom, and directly controls every prison, his fiat being law in all things to every official as well as to every inmate. He has officially recognized and registered at the Home Office every Prisoners' Aid Society in England, Scotland, and Wales, and in order to boom them, he gives to every discharged prisoner an extra gratuity of GBP 3 provided he joins a Prisoners' Aid Society on his discharge, the result being that all do so. England is a small and compact country, and the police have practically one head, and that head is the Home Secretary. 429. Under the circumstances, the system of police espionage is so perfect that whenever a discharged prisoner is reconvicted for another crime, he cannot escape recognition, and in all such cases the Home Secretary notifies the particular aid society who received the prisoner on his discharge of the fact, very much to the vexation of the officials of the society, who are all anxious for a good record in reforming men that come officially under their auspices. They publish that all who are never reported as reconvicted are reformed, and all love to make a big showing for the money subscribed at the all-important annual meeting, the result being that all the men hustled out of the country by the society count as reformed men. These societies are supported by subscriptions, which all go in salaries and office rents. The assistance given to the discharged prisoner is limited to the GBP 3 extra gratuity given the society by the government on the prisoner's behalf. The London societies have an agreement with the Netherlands Line and the Wilson Line of steamers to take to sea for GBP 210s all working men they send to them. I have talked to thousands of men who joined the society, most of whom intended to go to America, and I have talked to scores who had joined but who, unluckily for themselves, not leaving England, were reconvicted and sent back to Chatham. Throughout 20 years I conversed with several thousand men who joined the society avowing they were going to America, and were never heard of again in England, and have also known some scores of men who passed through the hands of the society agents, yet were afterward reconvicted. Chapter Roman 41. Well, my man, what do you intend to do? I want to go to America, sir. Tut, tut. You mean you want to go to sea? Yes, sir. I want to go to sea. The Royal Society and the Christian Aid Societies, presided over by a Rev. Mr. Whiteley, enjoy a bad preeminence in this respect. The year before my release, the latter stated at the annual meeting that 6,000 discharged prisoners had passed through his society, and I venture to assert that 5,000 of these found their way to this country through the assistance of this society. These two societies have been boomed to an incredible extent, and it would be a curious study if any report could be had as to how the large subscriptions were actually expended. For the sake of making my narrative clear, I will here only speak of the first named society. Leaving Liverpool, George Bidwell's farewell to John Bull. Leaving Liverpool, George Bidwell's farewell to John Bull. 2 months before release, the prisoner must inform the warder that he intends to join the Royal Society. He notifies the Home Office, which in turn notifies the society and forwards a warrant for GBP 3. The prisoner upon discharge takes a certain train for London and is met upon his arrival at the station by an agent of the society. This agent ranks as a servant, is usually an ex-prisoner, and is always paid 21 shillings a week. He pilots his man at a certain hour before the Reverend Secretary, and here follows a verbatim report of the dialogue between the great man and the poor, timid and dreadfully embarrassed ex-prisoner. Great man, well, my man, what do you intend to do? Ex-prisoner, I want to go to America. Great man, tut, tut. My man, You mean you want to go to sea? Ex-prisoner taking the hint. Yes, sir. I want to go to sea. Great man. Very well, my man. Go with this agent, who will fix it with the ship captain so you can go to sea. If a steamer of either line named is about to sail, he is taken on board at once, goes to the steerage, and just before sailing the agent hands him a ticket, and the criminal is safely off for America. England is rid of a bad subject, and the Royal Society has one more reformed man to put in its report. In addition to the GBP 3 gratuity, the ex-prisoner has been paid GBP 1, GBP 2 or GBP 3 in addition, provided his sentence had been at least 5 years. The society is not a cent out of pocket over him, and forlorn and friendless he lands here with from $2 to $15 in his pocket. He has got the cheap suit of clothes he wears, one handkerchief, and one pair of stockings extra. It is almost certain he will speedily drift into crime, spending the remainder of his life in prison, and finally dying there or in the poorhouse. 433. There is just one way this evil can be stopped. I may say 2 ways. The first, and a method that would be effectual in stopping the influx of criminals from all countries, is to let Congress put a tax of $30 or $50 on the steamship companies for every passenger not an American citizen whom they bring to America. Not one discharged criminal in 1,000 could meet the tax in addition to the fare. The only other way possible would be for our government to request the English government to furnish them with photographs, marks, and measurements of all discharged criminals, then have them copied and sent to the immigration commissioners of our ports. But that would involve a radical change in these boards and their methods. Efficiency there under our corrupt system is, I fear, hopeless. I visited Ellis Island a few days ago and saw how they passed a shipload of immigrants in a few minutes, and as I looked I felt it was hopeless to expect any efficient measures to throw back the foul tide that is polluting our shores. Seldom, as men of the criminal class once safe in America ever return to England, yet they do now and then return. In the 2 or 3 cases that came under my observation, it was very much to their loss and grief, for they only came back to undergo another term. One day, in 1890, a man working in my party slipped a note into my hand that had been given him for me in chapel that morning. As in similar cases, I secreted the note, and when safe in my little room I read it. The writer said he had lately come down from London, and was most anxious to get into my party in order to have a chance to talk with me. He said he had been living in Chicago, and could give me all the news. He ended the note by stating he was being murdered by hard work, and implored me to try and get him into my party, where it was not so hard. This I was most anxious to do, as in my party you could talk almost with impunity. To have a man near me fresh, and only a year before in Chicago, would be like a letter from home and also a newspaper. Therefore, I determined to get Foster in my party if possible. At this time I had been 17 years a resident and was, in fact, the oldest inhabitant, and had some little influence in a quiet way. About 11 years before I had been put in the party, and had a chance to learn bricklaying, and having become an expert in the art was given charge of the bricklaying. I was on the best of terms with our officer, so when, a day or 2 later, one of our men was so fortunate in the Chatham view of it as to meet with an accident and be admitted to that heaven, the infirmary, I told my officer to ask for Foster to replace him. He did so, and he, very much to his gratification, found himself by my side with a trowel instead of a shovel in his hand. We worked side by side, winter and summer, storm and shine, for 2 years, and in spite of myself I began soon to like the man. His chief and only virtues were truthfulness and fair-mindedness toward his friends, rare and incongruous virtues for a professional burglar. Nevertheless, he possessed them in a marked degree. This is a statement to make a cynic smile, and is one of those cases where the result is justifiable. Yet, however the cynic may smile, there is plenty of all-around good faith in the world, and there is no nation, race or color, no clique, religion nor social strata, that has a monopoly of the article. Good faith and truth grow in unlikely places, as I have found in my career, for I have looked on life from both sides, and to look on it from the seamy side is instructive, truly, for then the mask is off and the true character is revealed. Chapter Roman 42. Many a man more dangerous writes Alderman after his name. Foster's experience during his 4 years' residence in Chicago was decidedly novel, and it had evidently brightened his wits, that is, increased his cunning without adding to his honesty. And as I think it will interest my reader to get a view of life from the actor's own standpoint, I will relate one of the many stories he told me during the years we worked together. Upon Foster's release from his first term of imprisonment, he joined the Christian Aid Society of London, and Mr. Whiteley, the secretary, promptly sent him to sea, as he has thousands of others. In due time he arrived in New York, but as he had heard much of Chicago, he determined to go there. He arrived penniless, but within an hour ran against an old friend in the person of a former partner in the art of burglary, who had been a fellow prisoner with him in London. This man's name was Turtle, and Mr. Whiteley had only sent him to sea 2 brief years before. It was plain from his magnificent diamond ring, pin, and big bank roll freely displayed that the seafaring life of the former protege of the London Prison Aid Society was a profitable occupation. He was delighted to meet Foster, and took him to a tailor's at once and fitted him out liberally, at the same time handing him $250 just for pocket money, 437 when, on the next day, Foster stated to his friend that he was ready to undertake a burglary. Turtle was displeased and said, "No, we are on the honest game, which pays better." What that was will appear. Turtle had a large private inquiry office, with 2 of the city detectives for side partners, who turned over to him all business in which there was a prospect of mutual profit. All imaginable schemes of villainy were concocted and executed there, and with perfect impunity, too. For Turtle had the ear of all the magistrates, and was in with all the gangs that made the City Hall of Chicago the worst and vilest den of robbers that encumbers this earth. What cause the pessimist has for his boding views when in cities like New York, Quaker Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco, the city halls, those centers of municipal life, hold and are ruled by the worst and most dangerous gangs of criminals sheltered by any roof in any city. Alas, that the center, which should be the purest stream within the city, should be a foul cesspool, sending out poisonous vapors to pollute the life of the citizens. Universal suffrage in our great centers is a corrupt tree, and its fruits must needs be poisonous. Turtle gave his friend Foster a welcome at his office, and at once enrolled him on his staff, but virtually made him a member of the firm. So, between the 2 police headquarters thieves and the 2 English ones, they had a combination truly. Many stories Foster told me during the years of our intercourse, that were novel and strange, and gave me a view of the social world seldom seen. Here is a specimen. One day a countryman appeared at police headquarters in Chicago and announced that he had been robbed of $20, and showed how his coat pocket had been cut open and the money taken. This, he explained, had been done in a crowd. It was a strange place for a man to carry so 438 large a sum, and, still stranger, the pocket was cut on the inside. Of course, a pickpocket, in the rare event of cutting the pocket of an intended victim, must of necessity cut the pocket from the outside. The countryman had fallen at headquarters to the tender mercies of the 2 partners of Turtle. One glance at the pocket showed them there was a colored gentleman in the Woodbell, and as there was $20 in the deal somewhere, they determined to have some share of it. They, of course, pretended to believe the story of the countryman, but for fear some of the other headquarters men may hear and want a share, they hurried him away from the office over to the Sherman House. Then one went to Turtle's office and posted him on the situation. The countryman was anxious to leave town, but on various pretenses they held him for 2 days. But as he stoutly affirmed that the lost money was his own, they were puzzled to solve the mystery. But their knowledge of human nature was such that they felt certain that if they could only arrive at the bottom, the old gentleman would not be quite as white as he pretended to be. He came from an obscure mountain town in East Tennessee, and, While they fancied a trip there may solve matters, they feared to lose their victim. For victim these human tigers determined the countrymen should be. The second day they resolved on decisive measures to get at the truth, and at the same time secure some plunder, provided the Tennessean had any cash. So far Turtle and Foster had not been seen by the victim. The detectives asked the countryman to remain one more night to see if they could not catch the men who had robbed him. That afternoon one of Turtle's staff secured a room at the same hotel, and, seizing an opportunity, slipped into the countryman's chamber and concealed some burglar tools under the mattress of his bed and in his carpet bag. This once done, they marched the guy along Clark Street, and, as arranged, Turtle and one of his staff met them, and 439 shaking hands with the two detectives asked if they were arresting their companion for a job. Upon their saying he was a wealthy gentleman from the South, Turtle burst out laughing, and said he knew him for an old-time burglar, and if they would search his house they would find stolen goods, and ended by saying, "Bring him down to my office, and I will show you his picture." The detectives now changed their tones and threatened to arrest him. He having, as the sequel will show, a bad conscience, became frightened. Then they arrested him, and announced that they were going to search his room at the hotel. This they did, taking him along. Of course, they found what they had previously hidden, very much to the terror of the countryman, who, lashed by a bad conscience, began to think he was in a fix. The friends of the hour before now became threatening bullies, promising to get him 10 years for the possession of burglar tools. They took him to Turtle's office, and there stripping him they found to their disappointment that he had no money, but found carefully folded up in an inner pocket a post office receipt for a registered letter sent from Nashville to St. Paul. They kept him a prisoner that night, while Turtle left by the first train for St. Paul with the receipt in his pocket. The next morning found him in St. Paul, and a few minutes later he walked out of the office with the registered letter, which proved to be a bulky one. Tearing it open he found it full of United States bonds and greenbacks, amounting in all to $20. The next day all save $10 reserved for the victim was divided among the 4 birds of prey. That day the victim was taken before a friendly magistrate, and fully committed to await in jail the action of the grand jury. 24 hours later a tool called on him at the jail, and gave him the option of taking $10 and getting out of town by the first train, or getting 10 years for the possession of burglar tools. The poor fool, with trembling eagerness, accepted the first part 440 of the ultimatum, and within an hour a bail bond was filled up, and darkness found the baffled old man speeding westward, never again to look on his own people. But how was he a baffled old man? He had embarked in a scheme of villainy, but had been beaten at his own game by sharper rascals. From whom did he steal the money? Read. In a small Tennessee town there lived a widow whose husband had been killed in the Confederate Army, and who found herself, like so many more Southern ladies at the close of the war, impoverished, and with a family of children to be provided with bread. But it seems she was a brave body and with a head for business. She opened a small hotel in Nashville, and by reason of her history, no less than her excellent hostelry, she thrived apace, and, investing all her savings in newly started industrial enterprises in Nashville, her small investments brought in large returns, which were reinvested, until at 40, finding herself mistress of a competency, she quit business and went to spend the remainder of her days where she was born. The hero of the adventure in Chicago was not only her neighbor, but had been a comrade of her husband through the deadly fights of the war. She naturally turned to him as a friend for advice. He first asked her to be his wife, and upon her refusal he began to urge her to dispose of all her interests in Nashville and reinvest her money in the nearby city of Knoxville. At last she consented and sent him to Nashville with authority to act as her agent. He disposed of her property, except the old hotel. He was paid $20 on her account, and once with the money in his possession he determined to keep it. It was a cowardly deed, and dearly did he pay for it. He wrote her he was going to Chicago, and would take the money with him, as he would only remain for a day. To Chicago he came, and, as related, robbed himself, sending off the money in a registered letter to himself. Then he appeared at police headquarters with his cut pocket and clumsy story, which appeared in the next morning's paper. He sent a marked copy of the paper to the lady, and at the same time wrote a hypocritical letter stating that he was so heartbroken over losing her money that he did not have the courage to look her in the face, and never should until such time as he could repay the money. He said he was going to California to work, and when he had enough she would see him again, but not before. I resolved to leave a message of hope and high resolve. I resolved to leave a message of hope and high resolve. How easy it is for a man to become an unspeakable villain, and how nicely this one was hoisted with his own petard. Eventually this catastrophe proved a blessing to the widow. It drove her back to her hotel again, and soon after she became the wife of one of the bravest and best men Tennessee ever produced. I was so interested in the fate of this lady that when in Nashville in 1893 I tried to hunt her up. I found several who knew the whole story, and from them I heard her after history and a full confirmation of Foster's narrative. Foster remained 4 years in Chicago and flourished. He and Turtle became very influential in politics and partners in a combine of rascally aldermen and police magistrates that robbed the city and the citizens with impunity. But unluckily for him, he one day took it into his head to pay a visit to his old haunts in England, there to display his diamonds and bankroll to such of his former cronies as happened to be at liberty. On arriving in London, he began to play the role of a rich American, but was recognized by the police, an old charge raked up against him, arrested, promptly placed on trial, found guilty and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Although the possessor of considerable property, he is today toiling at Chatham like a slave, and probably, if he lives, he will come out a broken man. It is a certainty that the very day he is liberated he will 442 go to sea, being sent by a prisoners' aid society, and a few days later become an ornament to that good city of Chicago. Once there, his ambition will not be satisfied until he takes his seat as alderman, becoming one of the city fathers. Chapter Roman 43. A battered hulk stranded on a shore to which no tide returns. I am glad to say that during the almost lifetime I passed at Chatham there were only a scant half-dozen Americans who came down to keep me company. One, Stoneman by name, interested me. He was a man of great nerve and quick apprehension, and very truthful. Therefore I found his stories of his adventures most interesting, besides the fact that his history was another proof of the truth that wrongdoing never pays. Stoneman was of good parentage, and had entered the army in 1861, making a good record up to and including the Battle of Gettysburg. There, owing to a quarrel with his captain, he deserted and became a bounty jumper, making a large amount of money. But when the war ended, finding his occupation gone, he entered upon a life of crime, starting out first as a very successful express robber. The last robbery he engaged in that line was on the New Haven road near Norwalk. His share amounted to some thousands, but he was literally bowled out, and by a singular circumstance. One of his confederates by the name of Riley had been arrested and was confined at Norwalk. He engaged as counsel for his chum a well-known criminal lawyer of New York by the name of Stewart, and arranged with him to go up to Norwalk to see Riley the following day. Although Stoneman had plenty of money, he told Stewart he had none, but Riley had. Then he gave 444 Riley's wife $500, and told her to be present at the interview between the lawyer and her husband. At the interview Riley told him he would give him $500 if he cleared him, or $10 if he got him off with a sentence of 2 years or less. Stewart was hungry as a shark to finger the money, and writing out a receipt for the full amount inserted the conditions agreed upon. Putting the money in his pocket he started back to New York with Mrs. Riley. Stoneman was on the train waiting for them, and as soon as they started he joined them. It happened the train was crowded and they had to stand. It seems some pickpocket saw Stewart pull out the money and determined to get it from him. On the arrival of the train in New York he succeeded in doing so. Stoneman had hurried out of the station and, of course, knew nothing of the loss. So soon as Stewart discovered his loss, he blamed him for it, and, being in a fury, he flew to police headquarters, secured the services of a friendly detective, and, going to the hotel that he knew Stoneman frequented, had him arrested on a charge of robbing him. The end of it all was that Stewart and the detectives got all his money, and then, knowing him to be a daring man, one that would neither forget nor fear to avenge his wrong, to get him out of the way they betrayed him to the Connecticut police as one of the express robbers. He was sent to Norwalk to stand his trial, was convicted and sentenced to 5 years, and sent to Wethersfield. Being a good mechanic, he was put in the blacksmith shop, and there, with an eye to the future, he did what is frequently done by professional gentlemen in our prisons, made a complete and most finely tempered set of burglar tools. They were too bulky to be smuggled out by friendly warders, so he secreted them in the shop, where he worked and ruled. Many of the prisoners in Wethersfield are expert workmen, and from the machine shops there a high class of work is turned out. Among other workshops, there is one for the manufacture of silver 445 plated ware. Stoneman had made chums with one of the prisoners, who held a confidential position in the silverware manufactory. As Stoneman's sentence was the first to expire, he gave him points, and it was plotted between them that the prison itself should be burglarized by Stoneman on a certain night after his release. The confidential man was to leave the way clear to the safe, where the silver bars used in the business were stored. He in due time was liberated, with the customary injunctions from the warden and officers not to come back any more. He did come back, but in a way entirely unanticipated by them. He, of course, knew the whole routine of the place, the stations of the guards, and that the wall after 8 p.m. was left entirely unguarded. The second night after his liberation found him beneath the wall with no other implements than a light ladder of the right height. In a minute he was on top, had pulled his ladder up and lowered it inside. Once inside, every inch of the place was familiar to him, and he had a clear field. The shops, although inside of the boundary walls, were quite separate from the main building, where the men, closely guarded, were confined. He entered the familiar room where he so long had worked, and easily placed his hands on his to him precious kit of tools, and carried his jimmies, wedges, sledges, bits, braces, drills, etc. to the wall, and then landed them safe outside. Then he returned and entered the room where the plunder he sought lay. Thanks to his friend, the way was easy, and his hour was not required to secure it. There were 600 ounces in silver bars, a pretty good load in avoirdupois, but he only made one journey of it, mounted the wall, and speedily was over. Stoneman was a long-headed fellow. He had taken, without the owner's leave, one of the many boats on the banks of the nearby river. He carried his plunder and tools down to the boat, and pulled across the river, 2 miles down, to where quite a stream empties into the Connecticut. He pulled some distance up it, then putting everything into bags he sank them in the creek. Then drifting back into the Connecticut River again, he threw his ladder over and turned the boat adrift. At 7 o'clock the next morning he was in New York. In due time, in the idiom of the professionals, he raised his plant, and the burglar's kit manufactured in the Connecticut State Prison did what Stoneman considered yeoman service. With all his art and cunning, justice would not be cajoled by him, but weighed him in her balance, to a good purpose too. His success in his particular line was great, but he paid dearly for it all. Many times he escaped detection, but not always. Not to escape, but to be brought to the bar, means a fearful gap in the life of a criminal. He was, as I say, famous in certain circles for his success in his lawless course. Yet in the 20 years between 1865 and 1886 he passed 16 years in captivity. In that year he went to England with a confederate, and a few hours later in London they snatched a parcel of money from a bank messenger in Lombard Street. Both were caught in the act and sentenced at the Old Bailey to 20 years each. Today Stoneman is toiling under brutal taskmasters, and it is all but certain he will perish at his task, friendless, alone, unpitied. Chapter Roman 44. I find the Fenians with me in the toils. I had, of course, for many years heard much of the Fenian prisoners in the English prisons, particularly Sergeant McCarty and William O'Brien. Soon after my arrival at Chatham, I was placed in the same party with them. We were all three strongly drawn together, but were shy of being the first to speak. Of course, it was strictly against the rules to talk, but as a matter of fact the prisoners find many opportunities for talking, particularly if they do their work. The officers are reported and fined if their men fall behind in their task. So if a man is any way backward in working, the officer keeps his weather eye open and reports him for any infraction of the rules. One day, soon after they were put in my party, I gave O'Brien a hand in fixing his run. We spoke a few words. The ice was broken. We soon became fast friends, and our friendship remained unbroken until their happy release some years after. They were fine, manly fellows, and I in time came to have a warm affection for them. McCarty had for nearly 20 years been a sergeant in the English army. He had come out of the Indian Mutiny with a splendid record, and had been recommended for a commission, but while wearing the British uniform, his heart was warm for Ireland and her cause. So when, in 1867, his battery being then stationed in Dublin, he was informed many devoted adherents to the Fenian cause had determined 448 to try and seize Dublin, with a view of starting a wide revolt against English domination. Perilous as it was, he cast his lot in with them, and speedily found sufficient adherents in his own field battery to seize it and bring it into action against the English. The plan miscarried. Sergeant McCarty, along with many others, was arrested and tried for treason. As a matter of course, was speedily convicted and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. O'Brien was an enthusiastic youngster of 17 and an ardent patriot. He had enlisted in a regiment then stationed in Ireland for no other reason than to familiarize himself in military affairs, also to win over recruits to the Fenian cause, and when the revolt began to be in a position to seize arms. The result of it all, so far as my two friends were concerned, they found themselves by my side in the great Chatham ship basin loading trucks with mud and clay, and that upon a diet of black bread and potatoes. The cars, or trucks, held 4 tons. There were 3 men to a truck, and the task was 19 trucks a day, and between the urging of officers, frightened themselves for fear the task may not be done, and the mud and starvation, it was despairing work. 449. The punishments were not only severe, but were dealt out with a liberal hand. The men, as a rule, were willing to work, but between weakness, brought on by perpetual hunger, and the misery of the incessant bullying of the officers, some few suicided every year, but many more did worse to themselves, that is, the poor fellows, seeing nothing but misery before them, would when the trucks were being shifted on the rail deliberately thrust an arm or leg under the wheels and have it taken off. No less than 22 did this in 1874. Of course, the object was to get out of the mud. When once a man's leg or arm was off, he would no longer be able to handle a shovel, and would necessarily be 450 placed in an inside or cripple's party and set to work picking oakum or breaking stones, with the result that, being free from severe toil and sheltered from the storms, they would not be so hungry. Then, again, they could more easily escape being reported, and that meant much. Condemned to be hanged. Condemned to be hanged. Weighing office, Bank of England. Weighing office, Bank of England. There was never anything but black bread for breakfast and supper, save only 1 pint of gruel with the bread for breakfast. For dinner every day we got a pound of boiled potatoes and 5 ounces of black bread. 3 days a week 5 ounces of meat, that is, 15 ounces a week for a man toiling hard in the keen sea air. We were always on the verge of starvation. Our sufferings were terrible. In our hunger there was no vile refuse we would not devour greedily, if opportunity occurred. O'Brien was a slight, delicate fellow, quite unfitted for the hardships and toil he was subjected to, but he was a high-spirited, brave youngster, and his spirit carried him through, while many a man better fitted physically to endure the toil gave in and died, or became utterly broken down, and would be sent away to an invalid station of physical wreck. McCarty, and I used to do extra work so as to shield O'Brien, and so long as our trucks were filled on time, the officer made no complaint. The prisoners were certainly very good to each other, and usually did all in their power to help and cheer up the weaker men. In 1877, my two friends were liberated. I was glad to see them go, but I missed them sadly. But McCarty had suffered too much. He only survived his liberation a few days, dying in Dublin, to the grief of all Ireland. O'Brien started a tobacco store in Dublin, where he still is. I knew all of the dynamiters: Curtin, Daly, Doctor, Gallagher, Egan, etc. However misguided, yet they meant to serve their country, and dearly have they paid for their zeal. I pitied poor Gallagher. The strain on his spirit was too great. Chapter Roman 45. In mood as lonely, in plight as desperate as his, I have related how, the Sunday after my sentence, in my despair I took the little Bible off the shelf. The other books I had at Chatham besides the Bible were a dictionary and the life of the prophet Jeremiah. Once, soon after my arrival in Chatham, I took the Jeremiah down from the shelf, but speedily put it back and made a vow never to take it down again, and I never did. It remained in view on the little shelf for 19 years, while I sat there watching it rot away. The dictionary is a good book, but grows tiresome at times. As for the Bible, there is no discount on that. For 14 years I was a careful student of its sacred pages. Every Sunday of that 14 years, from 12 o'clock until 2, I used to walk the stone floor of my cell preaching a sermon with no audience but my dictionary and the life of the prophet Jeremiah. I at first began my Bible studies and my sermons as a means to occupy my thoughts and keep my mind bright. It saved my life and reason. I need hardly say that I became tolerably familiar with the book, and I had the great advantage of studying the Bible without a commentary. I thought in my enthusiasm I should never tire of the Bible, but after 10 or 12 years I began to grow weary of it, and grew very hungry for other mental food. I wanted a Shakespeare, for with him to keep me company I could no longer be in the desolation of solitude. At last I did her 454 mind to get my friends to try for me. I had learned the Bible almost by heart. The smallest incidents in the life of the prophet Jeremiah were much more familiar to me than the history of the Civil War, and Anathoth took on proportions which made it as real as New York, and far more important. The desperate efforts I had made to keep myself from falling into the condition of so many I had seen drooping to idiocy and death were, I felt, successful, and any occupation which kept alive the intellect could not but be beneficial. I was hungry, starving for mental food. Never had books appeared so attractive, never was kingdom so cheerfully offered for a horse as I would have offered mine for an octavo. My friends had written for me to the government, but with no success. At last they had interested the American minister in London, who promised to write to the Home Secretary for me, but a year had slipped by and I had heard nothing. Jeremiah continued with me, and it seemed he was to remain with me to the end. But a change was coming. Can I ever forget the day it happened? Can I ever cease to remember the delight, the incredulity, the astonishment of that happy day? I had come in at night hungry, cold, wet, and miserable. I made my way a little depressed to my cell. As I was about to step across the threshold, I saw a book lying on my little wooden bed. Amazed and astonished, I hesitated to enter. Small as such a circumstance appears, the very sight of the book brought on a weakness. I feared to pick it up. A horrible dread seized me that it may be a new Bible, and I was unwilling to risk another disappointment. The footprint on the sand was not more suggestive nor more awe-inspiring to Robinson Crusoe than the appearance of that book was to me. In mood as lonely, in plight as desperate as his, there lay before me a sight as unlooked for and, as it seemed, as full of meaning as the footprint was to Robinson. 455. At last I pulled myself together, determined to end the suspense and know what was before me. I picked up the book, and who can understand the delight, the joy, the rapture evening with which I read on the title page the works of William Shakespeare? In an instant I became a new man. If ever one human being felt gratitude to another, I felt it at that moment for the American minister. To him I owed it that henceforth a new light was to stream through the fluted glass of my window, that henceforth a new world was opened up for me to live in, and the world seemed lighter to me. Many a month and year afterward my cell was filled and my heart cheered by the multitude of friends the divine William provided for me. About the time I received my Shakespeare, another piece of happy fortune befell me. A smallpox scare was existing outside, and all hands in the prison were ordered to be vaccinated. When the doctor came around a few days afterward to examine the effects of the operation, he found my arm so swollen that he directed me to be taken to the hospital. For 25 days I had full opportunity to learn what the girl in Dickens' Little Dorrit meant when she called the hospital an evenly place. It was the first time I had ever been admitted, and the change from the horrible mud hole to the rest and comfort of a cell in the hospital was truly almost evenly. With nothing to do but to read my Shakespeare, the cravings of hunger for the first time since my imprisonment satisfied, I was tempted to believe, I did partly believe, that the world had few positions pleasanter than mine. Godliness with contentment is undoubtedly great gain. Contentment alone without the godliness is no poor thing, and was I not content? Few, truly, of all the thousands who have toiled in that torturing prison house have ever been or are likely ever to be so content as I was. How true it is that happiness is altogether relative, and that it is divided much more evenly among men than we are willing to believe. A mere respite from an intolerable position, a single book to keep the mind from cracking, transformed gloom and misery into light and at least comparative happiness. After a time I began to watch the effects of the unnatural life upon others. They arrived full of resolution, buoyed often by hopes, which they were soon destined to find delusive. The short-time men, those with 7 or 10-year sentences, could face the prospect hopefully. To them the day would come when the prison gate must swing back and the path to the world be open once more. But no such hope cheers the long-timers, the men with 20 years and life, who quickly learn how great the proportion is of their number who find relief only in the box smeared with black which encloses what is left of them in the grave. Every day I used to see the effects on them of hunger and torment of mind. The first part visibly affected was the neck. The flesh shrinks, disappears, and leaves what look like 2 artificial props to support the head. As time wears on, the erect posture grows bent. Instead of standing up straight, the knees bulge outward as though unable to support the body's weight, and the man drags himself along in a kind of despondent shuffle. Another year or 2 and his shoulders are bent forward. He carries his arms habitually before him now. He has grown moody, seldom speaks to any one, nor answers if spoken to. In the general deterioration of the body the mind keeps equal step, and so unfailing is the effect that evening warders wait to see it, and remark to each other that so and so is going off. When the sufferer begins to carry his arms in front, every one understands that the end is coming. The projecting head, the sunken eye, the fixed, expressionless features are merely the outward exponents of the hopeless, sullen brooding within. Sometimes the man merely keeps 457 on in that way, wasting more and more, body and mind, every day, until at last he drops and is carried into the infirmary to come out no more. Truly I was looking on life from the seamy side. Before my own experience had taught me, I used to think at times, when such a subject ever came into my mind at all, what must be the thoughts and anticipations of a man condemned to separation from other men, to lead an unnatural life under the strained and artificial conditions of prison? The change is so violent, it comes so suddenly, the unknown possibilities are so terrible, the sufferings naturally implied are so inevitable, that had any one gifted with a knowledge of futurity shown me that such experience was to be mine, I would have thought it utterly impossible that such horrors could be withstood by ordinary strength. The delights of pleasure are seldom equal to the anticipation of them, and it is probable that the pain of suffering is more unbearable in the shrinking expectation than when affliction actually opens her furnace door and commands us to enter. Perhaps there is a compensation of some kind in nature, a provision to deaden feeling when a death stroke falls, some merciful dispensation by which we fail to realize or to understand in its exactness the meaning of the stroke which is crushing us. The man rescued from drowning or from asphyxiation has felt no pain. The animal that falls beneath the rush and the murderous claws of a beast of prey seems to fall into a torpor-like indifference, under the influence of which he meets with no great suffering the death his captor brings him. Probably all great suffering comes accompanied with a reserve of strength or with a power of resistance which may evening spring from weakness, but which invests the sufferer with courage, and perhaps, too, with hope, to meet it. Transcriber's note: but the pitiless application of a discipline designed with consummate skill to find out all the weak points of a man's inner armor, and to inflict the utmost possible suffering upon him. I used to ask myself if it could be possible that I was really the man upon whom so hideous a fate had fallen. The blackness of darkness was round about me. Infinite despair stood ready to seize me. It seemed an amazement that life should be forced to remain with him who longs for death, who would rejoice exceedingly, and be glad could he find the grave. But when the first horrible numbness of the shock was disappearing, when the first glimmering perception came to me that, as a man's day so shall his strength be, I began to suspect, and soon to know, that in many ways the reality was not so terrible as imagination pictured it. However ample the provision be which men may make to inflict suffering upon other men, however well and successfully they may apply the provision, they cannot alter men's nature. That will assert itself under all circumstances. The fact that a man is restrained of his liberty by no means alters his nature. Chapter Roman 46. If pain is not an evil, it certainly is a very good imitation. The world inside of the walls has a public opinion of its own, and it is at least quite as often just as the public opinion whose sphere is not circumscribed by stone walls and iron bars. The man who accepts the situation, resolved to get his hand as easily as possible out of the tiger's mouth, soon becomes known as a sensible fellow, willing to give others no trouble and anxious to have no trouble given him. Such a man will rarely be molested. Patient, uncomplaining endurance always excites pity and sympathy. The most ignorant, the most brutal warder will scarcely oppress the man who goes quietly and unresistingly along the thorny road stretched out before him, who, not taking the thorns for roses, is not disappointed at finding few roses among the thorns. Those, however, who are determined to see the rough side of prison life may easily do so. The appliances are there and they will certainly be accommodated. An English prison is a vast machine in which a man counts for just nothing at all. He is to the establishment what a bale of merchandise is to a merchant's warehouse. The prison does not look upon him as a man at all. He is merely an object, which must move in a certain rut and occupy a certain niche provided for it. There is no room for the smallest sentiment. The vast Ma 460 chine of which he is an item keeps undisturbed upon its course. Move with it and all is well. Resist, and you will be crushed as inevitably as the man who plants himself on the railroad track when the express is coming. Without passion, without prejudice, but also without pity and without remorse, the machine crushes and passes on. The dead man is carried to his grave, and in 10 minutes is as much forgotten as though he had never existed. The plank bed, the crank, the bread and water diet, unauthorized but none the less effectual clubbing at the hands of warders, the cold in the punishment cells penetrating to the very marrow of the bones, weakness, sickness, and unpitied death are the certain portion of the rebel. Some are found idiotic enough to invite such a fate, though fewer now than formerly. The progress of education in England during the last 20 years, and the philanthropic efforts of many societies and private persons, but above all the covert but successful efforts of the authorities to deport them to this country instantly after their release, have had an immense effect in thinning the ranks of prison inmates. The judges, too, have been forced by public opinion to be much less severe than they used to be, and that counts for much evening in the inside of prisons. Nothing can be more capricious than the sentences they pass. In very few cases does the law set any limit. Life or any term not less than 5 years is the usual reading of the statute books, and the consequence naturally is that one judge will give his man 5 years, while another will condemn his to 20 years for precisely the same crime committed under precisely the same circumstances as the first one. Another great blot on the English judicial system is that no court of appeal exists to which a sentence may be referred for review, so that the most unjust and unequal 461 tenses are constantly passed from which there is no appeal but in the forlorn hope, rather, entire hopelessness, of a petition to the Home Secretary. I have often seen a man who had been sentenced to 5 years for murder working by the side of another whose sentence was 20 years for some crime against property. Such contrasts, of course, excite great discontent, and in some cases are the reason why men set up a hopeless resistance to what they feel to be persecution and injustice. It always seemed to me that the standpoint of the Board of Directors, established in 1864, and which continued without change until very recently, was altogether wrong. They appeared to think that in their dealings with other men the only course was to be the application of force, iron force, as one of the governors expressed it. The very great majority require no such application, and the few difficult ones could easily be managed in another way. Certainly it is necessary that all prison discipline be penal, but it is not necessary that it be ferocious and inhuman, as certainly is the English. Starvation, the crank, the plank bed, the fearful cold of the cells are not measures necessary in dealing with any man, whatever they could think of to harden, to degrade, to insult, to inflict every form of suffering, both physical and mental, which a man could undergo and live, was embodied in the rules they made. Their prisons were to be places of suffering, and of nothing but suffering. So far as the directors were concerned, the regulations were carried out to the letter, but each prison is under the control of a resident governor, with a deputy governor to assist him. These gentlemen are always men of good social position, retired officers of the army, who have seen the world and have experience in controlling men. They are rarely inclined to unnecessary severity, but are generally willing to apply the rules with as much consideration as such rules admit. 462 The governor's discretion, however, is limited, but daily contact more or less with men whom he sees to differ very little from free men, and whom he sometimes finds to be even better than many he knows who are not, but who perhaps ought to be, on the wrong side of the bars, makes him unwilling to throw too many sharp points on the path which has to be trodden by men for whom he often cannot help feeling considerable sympathy. I have more than once heard governors express their disapproval of the starvation system, and of the ferocity of treatment toward men who some day or other must go back to society. Under such governors the new arrival speedily finds out that to a certain extent his comfort depends upon himself. No man can make a bad thing good or trick himself into believing that suffering is pleasure. Chapter Roman 47. His row becomes filled with very sharp-edged stones. Truly, the inhabitant of a cell has a very rough row to hoe under any circumstance, and it has to be hoed, but there is no necessity for him to fill his row with stones and to plant roots in it himself. He soon finds his level, and the impression he makes on his arrival is the one which, as a rule, clings to him to the end. When prison air and prison influence have succeeded in encasing a man with the sort of moral hardbake that renders him callous to those feelings which at first so gall the raw spots, he finds himself watching with curiosity the shapings of newcomers. Some announce immediately on arrival that they cannot possibly be there more than a month or two. Their arrest was a mistake, and their uncle, the member of Parliament, is now busily engaged making representations to the Home Secretary. One of the very few amusements prisoners have is in watching the important fellows, the men whose friends could do so much for them, if they would only let them know where they are. Sometimes a chap who has perhaps been a body servant or something of the kind, who has picked up the kind of veneer he could catch by aping his master, will furnish food for smiles to every one he comes in contact with during his stay. He never receives a letter without explaining confidentially to everyone that another aunt whose favorite he was has just died, leaving him GBP 10,464 in cash, not to speak of a trifle or two in the shape of half a dozen houses. These gentlemen are immediately furnished with a name, which becomes much better known than their own, and whenever they have delivered themselves of their periodical brooding of lies, the news goes smiling round that Billy Treacle's aunt has died again, and left him another fortune. So long as their inventions do no more harm than make them ridiculous, they are only laughed at and let alone. But when one of them develops a talent for invention which molests or injures others, especially when it takes the form of confidential communication to the governor of what he sees, and still more of what he does not see, such retribution as both prisoners and officers can inflict is not long in falling. His row becomes filled with very sharp-edged stones truly, and roots, which tear his hands painfully. Nearly always these boastings are fathered by an absurd vanity, a desire ever to appear what they are not, and, while they think they are deceiving others, they deceive no one but themselves. One case I remember, though, was an exception. One young fellow made such use of his invention, and the story is so interesting and instructive as showing with what lofty respect English gentlemen are educated for the rights of property, that I shall relate it. 4 or 5 years after I went to Chatham, a young fellow named Frederick Barton arrived with a 10 years sentence for forgery. His appearance and manners were very much in his favor, and his conduct so confirmed the good first impression that he speedily became a favorite with everybody from the governor down. Some 3 years had slipped by, when one day he asked me if I would prepare a petition which he may send to the Home Secretary in the hope of obtaining a commutation of sentence. I liked the youngster very well, and readily consented, but told him that I doubted very much if he would get anything. The petition was sent, and in a few days the usual answer was returned, no grounds. He told me of his ill luck, and I said to him, "Look here, so long as you send up whining petitions asking for mercy, both you and they will be treated with contempt. If you wish to get that English gentleman in the Home Office to do anything for you, make him believe you are a millionaire. You will see whether he will do anything then for you or not." He laughed merrily at that. "A millionaire? Why, I haven't a sixpence. My father is only a private coachman at Tunbridge Wells." "That is nothing at all," I said, "if you will be guided by me, and let me manage things for you. I will have a petition sent in for you from the outside, and I feel sure we can get you out." An idea had just flashed into my mind, and I was eager to try it. At first he was a little timid about the venture, fearing that I may get him into trouble, but when he became convinced that I would do nothing of the kind, he consented. I had a warder in the prison who, in consideration of an occasional tip, used to act as my postman, sending my letters to my friends and bringing in theirs to me. Chapter Roman 48. He telegraphed the news to my warder, and Barton went on his way rejoicing. My warder friend supplied me with writing materials. I prepared one letter, which I had him copy, and another in my own handwriting. Both were directed to Barton, and informed him that his rich uncle had lately died, and had left him £160,000 in money and 16,000 acres of cotton land in India. He was also informed that his father had gone to India to look after the property, and that upon his return a petition would be presented to the Home Secretary, who it was hoped would grant his release. These 2 letters my warder sent to a friend of mine in London, with a note from me requesting him to post 467 them immediately. I told Barton what I had done, at the same time cautioning him to guard the closest secrecy. 2 days afterward the letters arrived, and I directed my protege to spread the news as much as possible, to tell all the warders he saw, and to show them his letters. We had at that time in the prison a wide-awake but tricky fellow named George Smith. He had been clerk to an important firm of auctioneers in London, and had been sentenced by probably the most savage judge on the bench, Commissioner Kerr, to 14 years imprisonment for receiving a quantity of stolen silverware, which he had his employers sell for him. He was about to be released, and I determined to make use of him, but with 468 out, letting him know the truth, for I knew that if he suspected he was merely doing a good turn for the chum he left behind him, he, like the Home Secretary himself, without the right kind of inducement, would have left his friend to stop where he was until the bottomless pit was frozen over hard enough to hold a barbecue on it. Barton, by my directions, told Smith of his good fortune and that he hoped on his father's return to be liberated. Smith then did exactly what I expected and wanted him to do. He said there was no need to wait until then. He was going to be released in a few days, and if you like, I will send in a petition for you. It can't do you any harm, and it may get you released immediately. Barton at once accepted the offer and told him that if successful, the post of manager on the Indian estate would be at his disposal. He also suggested to ask me to write the petition. Smith managed to see me in the course of the day and, supposing me to have no knowledge of the matter, explained the situation and asked me to write the petition. Needless to say, I promised everything asked for, and added that I would make it my business to have the petition in London at some place where he could find it the day of his discharge. Bank note storeroom, Bank of England. Bank note storeroom, Bank of England. Visitors at Newgate standing over the burying vault door leading to the Black Maria. Visitors at Newgate standing over the burying vault door leading to the Black Maria. The petition was prepared, setting forth all the interesting facts for the edification of the right honorable gentleman in the Home Office, and after being submitted to Barton and Smith, sent to the latter's address in London. 469. Millbank is a gigantic prison in the heart of London, every one of the 1,000 cells of which cost the government GBP 300 to build. This is the establishment where David Copperfield visited Mr. Uriah Heep when that gentleman was under a cloud, and heard him express the wish that everybody may get took up so that they could learn the error of their ways. For many years all London men whose sentences had expired were brought here for release, and here Smith came a few days after the petition was posted. 470 on the morning of his discharge, and within an hour after passing through the gates of Millbank he left the petition personally at the Home Office. 2 days afterward one of the clerks acknowledged its receipt, accompanied with the gratifying assurance that it was under consideration. A week later Mr. Smith was notified that the release would be granted. He immediately telegraphed the news to my warder, who told me, and I told Barton. 2 days more, and the release came down. Barton went on his way rejoicing, and everyone was glad at his happy fortune.